When a weary night shift clerk at an isolated 24-hour gas station stumbles upon a dirt-smudged boy at 2:43 a.m., the first words out of the child's mouth send chills through the clerk's spine. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Marcus stood behind the dimly lit counter, lost in thought, wishing the night would hurry. The gas station, a lonely outpost off a nearly deserted highway, always felt a bit colder during his shift. Maybe it was the way the harsh fluorescent lights exposed every scratch and stain on the old linoleum floor. Or perhaps it was the way the night stretched on without end, bringing with it an oppressive solitude that made his chest feel tight. Tonight felt heavier than usual. A quiet dread hovered, and even the hum of the overhead lights seemed ominous. He rubbed his tired eyes, still wearing his faded uniform shirt with his name stitched into the fabric. At 38, Marcus never thought his life would revolve around scanning barcodes for passing travelers, but life seldom played out the way anyone planned. His marriage had ended in a slow, painful unraveling a few years before, leaving him with an empty apartment and a growing pile of unpaid bills. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in months. The phone calls had gotten too hard, and the disappointment in her voice only fed his own self-loathing. Not a day passed that he didn't think about the family that slipped through his fingers. Sometimes, he tried to bury the memory of that last fight with his wife, the one where he stormed out and never came back. But on nights like this, when the outside world seemed asleep, those memories had a way of crawling back into his head. As the clock inched past 2:40 a.m., Marcus forced himself to break from his dark thoughts. The radio in the station's little office crackled. The local news anchor's voice buzzed with a story about a recent string of missing children. The details were fuzzy, but the anchor spoke with a tone that suggested mounting concern. Marcus tried not to dwell on the broadcast, but something about the story, about children never making it home, about families whose heartbreak was plastered on flyers in every grocery store window, made his heart twist. He left the counter to restock a shelf near the back of the store. Chips, candy bars, jars of pickles. The routine was almost automatic, requiring no real thought, which unfortunately gave his mind free rein to replay every regret. That was until he heard a faint sniffle near the freezers. He froze, the bag of chips in his hand forgotten. The sound was definitely out of place. Customers at this hour were rare, and the ones who did come by were usually bleary-eyed truckers looking to top off their tanks with coffee and diesel, not small figures with muffled sobs. Marcus set the chips aside and crept toward the noise, heart pounding a little harder with each step. Anxiety grabbed him in a chokehold. Part of him wanted to call out, to ask if someone was there, but a bigger part sensed something was wrong, and that new fear tightened like a knot in his throat. Rounding the corner, he saw him. A young boy curled up on the cold tile floor by the freezer. His clothes were grimy, his hair matted, and he had no shoes. A torn bag of chips, half-eaten, served as a makeshift pillow for his head. Marcus stopped in his tracks, brain scrambling to process. The boy didn't look older than 12. How in the world had he gotten there without Marcus noticing? And more pressing, what on earth was he doing alone at this hour, dressed like he'd run away from something terrible? Marcus spoke gently, his voice nearly a whisper in the quiet store. "Hey there, buddy. You all right?" He crouched down, trying not to spook the child. The boy stirred, blinking up at Marcus with fear-filled eyes. For a moment he seemed too terrified to speak. Then, in a trembling whisper, he said, "They only keep the quiet ones." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. The words were strange, almost cryptic. "Kid, what's your name?" Marcus asked, but the boy only glanced around, as if he was searching for exits, or for threats lurking beyond the aisles of candy and motor oil. "Do you need help?" Marcus tried again, his instincts telling him something dire was going on. The boy trembled, breathing quickly, hugging his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again without a sound. Marcus, heart pounding, reached gently for his phone. If there was a child involved, and the boy's haunting words weren't some bizarre misunderstanding, this could be serious. He could almost hear the radio newscaster's grim voice echo in his head, missing children, families searching everywhere. Marcus dialed the local police and explained the situation. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, as though this might be some late-night prank from a bored clerk in the boonies. Still, Marcus insisted. He told them about the missing children reports. He told them the boy was terrified. He described the child's state, dirty, barefoot, as if he'd been wandering for days. Finally, after a moment's hesitation, the dispatcher agreed to send a patrol car. Marcus noticed the boy's breathing becoming shallower, so he set the phone aside and tried to soothe him with a calmer tone. "It's all right. The police are coming," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The child stared at him, tears making tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. He spoke with that same shaky whisper. "I wasn't supposed to leave, but I had to. I walked too far." "What do you mean you weren't supposed to leave?" Marcus asked. No answer, just silence. The boy clammed up again, curling into himself. A wave of pity and fear washed over Marcus. He glanced outside. The highway stretched in darkness, and beyond it, tall trees blurred into the night. This place was already remote, but the mention of walking too far sounded foreboding. Where had he come from? Time dragged as Marcus waited for the police. He offered the boy a bottle of water and some more snacks, but the child took them hesitantly, like he feared any act of kindness might come with a price. Marcus's mind spun with scenarios: run away from an abusive home, maybe a foster child escaping something worse, possibly a kidnapping victim. That last thought made his stomach clench. Still, he tried not to jump to conclusions. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, the door to the gas station chimed, and two uniformed officers stepped in. One was older, with a stern yet weary face, and the other was younger, maybe in his late 20s, scanning the store as though braced for anything. Marcus showed them the boy, who shrank back, burying his face in his knees. The older officer, Sergeant Bowen, knelt gently beside the kid. "It's all right, son," he said in a soft voice. "We're here to help you. Can you tell us your name?" The boy just looked at him with wide, wet eyes. He wouldn't speak. Marcus wondered if the child had simply run out of trust for grown-ups or if fear had paralyzed him. Bowen tried again. "Do you have any family nearby?" The boy's voice was as quiet as before, trembling with the same ominous fear. "I walked too far. I wasn't supposed to." It was cryptic, unsettling. The younger officer took a step back and exchanged a concerned glance with Bowen. They soon decided to escort the boy to the station, where hopefully a child psychologist or a more comfortable setting could coax out what had happened. As they led him toward the patrol car, the younger officer, Officer Garcia, pointed to a set of small footprints they found by the station's back entrance. He beckoned Marcus over and explained in a low tone, "We don't see any tracks leading out toward the road, but look here, these tracks come from the woods." Marcus peered at the footprints. They seemed to emerge from the dense tree line behind the gas station. The forest beyond was thick, the kind that had gone largely unmaintained for decades. It was easy to imagine someone stumbling through it in the dark, but it was also terrifying. A child so young, in the middle of the night, forging a path that even experienced hikers might find daunting. Something was very wrong. Sergeant Bowen radioed for additional units. They followed the tracks a short way into the woods, shining flashlights on the dense underbrush. Marcus stood on the edge of the forest, heart thumping, while the boy was placed gently in the cruiser. Part of Marcus wanted to go in with the officers. Another part was relieved he wasn't obligated to trek through those dark woods. He felt a pang of guilt for his own relief. A child had come from somewhere out there, somewhere dark where secrets loomed. He tried to shake the feeling that something monstrous lurked just out of sight. 10 minutes later, the officers re-emerged, faces grim. They'd found a clue. The tracks led toward a rundown building that looked like an old foster home. It was hidden deeper in the forest, far off any main roads. They saw the faint glow of a porch light in the distance. It was enough to warrant immediate investigation. One officer stayed behind to wait for backup while the other prepared to drive the boy to the station. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus gave a statement, trying to piece together every detail. He told them how he'd found the boy, what he'd said, how he looked. While the officers were cordial enough, they also seemed disturbed. And the boy's cryptic words, "They only keep the quiet ones," played over in Marcus's head like a disturbing echo. Marcus found himself stuck in a place between sorrow and dread, silently hoping the child was just a runaway exaggerating some lesser situation. Yet the pit in his stomach told him it was something worse. Finally, the police left, taking the boy with them. Marcus was left in the silent station, the overhead fluorescence feeling harsher than before. He sat behind the counter, struggling to concentrate on his duties. The thought of the boy's dirty feet and terrified eyes haunted him. He wanted to go home, but his shift didn't end until morning, and even then, his empty apartment offered little solace. The radio in the back office had moved on to other local news, something about a canceled parade, leaving Marcus alone with 1,000 questions swirling through his mind. What had truly happened to that child? Where had he come from? And who was behind it? Over the next few hours, he did his best to function normally, tidying up, checking inventory, helping the occasional customer. But each time the doorbell chimed, he half expected another frightened child or maybe a furious adult demanding to know where the boy had gone. Sleep was out of the question. He planned to follow up with the police as soon as his shift ended, to ensure the kid was okay. Deep down, Marcus felt connected to the boy. He recognized a familiar desperation in him, that same sense of being alone in the world. Outside, dawn arrived slowly, the sky turning pink and then gray, washing away the last vestiges of night. By the time Marcus clocked out, he was exhausted, but he refused to let himself sleep. He headed straight to the local police station, a modest brick building near the center of town. Walking in, he felt oddly self-conscious, still wearing his stained uniform. The front desk officer, a tired woman with short hair, asked for his name. When Marcus explained he was the clerk who'd found the child, she gave him a sympathetic nod and told him to have a seat. He didn't wait long before a detective emerged, a tall, thin man in a wrinkled shirt, circles under his eyes deep enough to suggest he hadn't slept much either. "Mr. Turner?" the detective said, scanning Marcus's face. "I'm Detective Ellis. I understand you found the boy last night." Marcus nodded. "Is he okay? Did he say anything else about where he came from?" Detective Ellis motioned for Marcus to follow him down the corridor into a small interview room with a table and 2 chairs. A single overhead light buzzed. "We're still assessing his condition," the detective began, sitting down. "He's not speaking much. Pretty traumatized. Child Protective Services is on the way to see him, and we're getting him medical attention. You said he told you something about, they only keep the quiet ones." "Yes," Marcus said, swallowing hard. "He said that, and also something about walking too far and not being supposed to leave." Ellis made a note, eyes serious. "The patrol officers found footprints leading to an old foster home in the woods. We've received a few minor complaints about that place in the past. Nothing major, some allegations of neglect, but never anything that escalated. We paid the owner a visit late last night. He was cooperative enough. But let's just say the vibe was off." Marcus leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Ellis let out a slow breath. "He kept telling us the child must have snuck out, that the boy was a troublemaker. But the entire time, the man's hands were shaking. We heard some noises coming from inside. And the place had these locks on the cabinets and bars on a couple of windows, things that might suggest they were using some harsh methods to keep kids in line. Unfortunately, we need more evidence before we can remove any children. CPS is launching an investigation now. We've posted officers nearby to keep watch." Marcus felt anger building in his chest. What if that boy's words are a clue? They only keep the quiet ones. It sounds like they're harming these kids in some way. "We'll find out," Ellis said with a grim nod. "I can't share all the details, but suffice to say, we suspect something more is going on. Possibly more than just neglect." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. "I appreciate you coming in. If you hadn't called, we might not have realized how serious this was. We'll be in touch if we need a statement or any further details." Marcus stood there, feeling an unsettling cocktail of relief that the police were taking it seriously and frustration that the Fosters couldn't immediately be shut down. The laws around child welfare investigations were complicated. He understood that. But the image of a barefoot, frightened boy out in the cold kept replaying in his mind. "Anything else I can do?" Marcus asked quietly. Ellis gave a slight shake of his head. "Right now, just keep your phone on. If the boy says anything that references you or the gas station, or if new information surfaces, we may need you to confirm details." A pause, then a weary attempt at a reassuring smile. "Thanks for what you did. You might have saved that kid's life." The detective led Marcus out. Outside, morning light cut through the station's glass doors. Marcus left the building and walked aimlessly to his car. He sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel for a full minute before starting the engine. He was exhausted. All he wanted was to lay down. But then a thought hit him. If that boy was from a foster home, how many other kids were in there? How many were trapped, forced into silence by fear or worse? Marcus tried to push those thoughts away. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a middle-aged clerk who couldn't even manage his own life properly. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring the situation would haunt him forever. With a sigh, he pulled out of the station parking lot, heading back to his small apartment on the outskirts of town. He managed only a few hours of restless sleep before the phone rang. It was the gas station manager needing a shift covered. Marcus almost said no, but money was money, and he had rent to pay. He grumbled a reluctant yes, promising to clock in by late afternoon. A shower, a quick microwave meal, and a stiff cup of coffee later, he found himself right back in the fluorescent purgatory. Except this time, he couldn't pass the freezer aisle without imagining the boy curled up on the floor. The evening dragged. Every so often, an image of the foster home's manager, the man with shaking hands, drifted through his mind. He pictured locked doors, frightened children. In a rare spare moment, Marcus pulled out his phone to see if there were any online mentions of that foster home. A quick search with the limited Wi-Fi turned up almost nothing, just a vague listing in a local directory, an address that matched what the detective had mentioned, and some equally vague references to temporary housing for children with special needs. No reviews, no articles, no stories. Nothing to indicate a place of horror or a place of healing. Just a quiet, nondescript mention. But in Marcus's mind, it loomed ominously. That was when a pair of local officers came in. Two different faces this time, a man and a woman. They said they were following up on last night's call, checking the perimeter behind the station again. Marcus didn't get much out of them, but their presence made him realize the police were taking it seriously. Even so, he couldn't shake the sense that something big was about to break. After midnight, the station traffic trickled to nearly nothing. Marcus was about to refill the coffee when the phone at the register rang. Rarely did the store phone ring that late, except for maybe the manager or a lost trucker. He answered, "Hello, 24/7 Gas and Stop, Marcus speaking." A shaky voice, barely audible. "Is this the clerk who was working last night?" Marcus's heart jumped. "Yes, this is Marcus." "Who's calling?" A pause, then a whisper. "It's about the boy you found. I work at that foster home. I'm not safe to talk, but you need to know, the police are only scratching the surface. It's not just him. There are more. So many more." A click. The line went dead. Marcus stood frozen, holding the receiver. He felt the blood drain from his face. Somebody from that home? Possibly an employee? Or maybe a volunteer? He was pretty sure it was a woman, sounded terrified. His mind spun with questions. Why call him instead of the police? Maybe she had a reason to mistrust law enforcement or worried that the manager would find out she'd spoken. Or maybe she thought Marcus would push harder to expose them. He wanted to call the number back, but the caller ID just showed a blocked number. Shaken, Marcus jotted down what he remembered of the conversation and the approximate time, then slipped the note into his pocket. Another wave of dread washed over him, heavier than before. He didn't want to be part of something so dangerous, yet he felt an inescapable pull to do more. Maybe that was the father in him, the father who'd failed his own family and didn't want to fail again. Or maybe it was just basic decency. Either way, he knew he had to give this information to the detective. He found Detective Ellis's card in his wallet. Ellis had handed it to him when they spoke earlier. Marcus hesitated. It was 12:30 a.m., probably not the best time to call a detective's personal line. But this couldn't wait. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy, slightly irritated voice answered. Ellis speaking. Detective, it's Marcus Turner, the clerk who found the boy. Sorry for calling so late, but I just got a call from someone who claims to work at that foster home. They said the police are only scratching the surface, that there are more kids, and then they hung up. Ellis was silent for a moment, as if trying to clear his mind of sleep. Was it a man or a woman? I think it was a woman, but her voice was really quiet, kinda muffled. She sounded terrified. Did you recognize the voice at all? I've never heard it before, Marcus said. She said she wasn't safe, that it was too risky to talk. But it sounded urgent. Ellis sighed. All right, thanks for letting me know. I'll note this down and pass it along. If they call again, try to get more info. In the meantime, keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Let me know if you see or hear anything else. Will do, Marcus replied, though a heavy sense of helplessness weighed on him. He hung up, tension in his shoulders knotting up. The rest of the shift dragged on, but adrenaline kept Marcus vigilant. Every time a car pulled up, his heart pounded. He surveyed the store's security camera feeds on the monitor behind the counter. The shape of the forest behind the station loomed ominously in the black and white feed, stirred by the occasional breeze. He expected at any moment some figure might emerge from those woods again, or maybe the manager of the foster home himself would appear, enraged. But no one came. In the following days, the story of the found boy began to trickle into the local news. A small article mentioned that a child had been recovered near an isolated gas station, potentially linked to a suspicious foster home. Anonymous sources hinted that child welfare services were investigating possible abuses. Marcus followed every report meticulously, though details remained scarce. No mention of a bigger network or anything beyond a run-of-the-mill neglect case. Still, that phone call replayed in his mind. There are more. So many more. He returned to the police station once more to see if there were updates. Detective Ellis was polite but stressed, explaining that the foster home's manager had a license that was still valid and Child Protective Services was conducting their assessment. The manager had also hired a lawyer, and that lawyer was stonewalling any attempts by authorities to do an unannounced search. The policeman assured Marcus that official channels were being pursued, but these things took time. Meanwhile, the boy, still too traumatized to speak beyond short, cryptic phrases, remained in protective custody. Frustration gnawed at Marcus. Each day, he saw headlines about missing children. The news anchor would detail another family's search, another vigil. Some children were eventually found, but many were not. Marcus wondered if these cases could be connected. It seemed like more than coincidence, but he wasn't sure how to prove it. During one particularly slow night at the station, he found himself Googling everything he could about child trafficking, foster home abuses, and unscrupulous rehoming practices. The more he read, the more horrific it became. He found stories of children being shuffled around from one household to another with minimal oversight, especially if the children had behavioral or special needs. Some unscrupulous people treated fostering like a business, collecting checks from the state while neglecting or exploiting the kids. There were even mentions of black market adoptions. It all left Marcus nauseated, a part of him wishing he could close his eyes and erase what he'd learned. But late-night curiosity turned into something else, a sense of obligation. Maybe it was foolish. He had no training, no real power. He was just a nobody. Yet he felt more compelled than ever to speak out. The trouble was, he didn't know exactly who would listen. The local media? Another phone call to the detective? And what if the foster home's manager got wind of it and took action to cover his tracks? Midway through another graveyard shift, the store phone rang again. For a split second, Marcus's heart lurched, thinking it might be that unknown caller once more. But it was only his manager, complaining about some scheduling conflict. After that call, Marcus decided to do something else. He dialed the tip line for an investigative journalist from the local paper, someone known for covering tough stories. He left a voicemail summarizing the events, leaving out certain specifics to protect the child's identity. He explained a boy had been found, that there was suspicion of abuse at a local foster home and that he had reason to believe it was part of a larger problem. He added his own contact information, hoping the journalist would call back. Then he waited. Days passed. Detective Ellis did reach out briefly to ask if the woman from the foster home had called again, which she hadn't. A gnawing sense of dread built up inside Marcus, like he was watching something unravel in slow motion, powerless to stop it. Then, out of the blue, a slender man in his late 40s walked into the station late one night, wearing a crumpled blazer and a skeptical expression. He introduced himself as Damian Marshall, a reporter from the local paper. Marcus's heart jolted with cautious relief. Finally, someone was following up. "I got your message," Damian said, glancing around the near-empty store. "I apologize for taking so long to respond. I had to poke around, see if your story had any basis." "And?" Marcus asked, leaning forward with anxious curiosity. Damian nodded, lowering his voice. "It's definitely suspicious. The foster home you mentioned has been on a few radars, but never enough to blow it wide open. I've heard rumors about shady rehoming practices, kids who disappear with hardly a trace. I want to do a deeper investigation, but I need evidence, hard evidence, if I'm going to publish anything that might put us in the crosshairs of a lawsuit or worse." Marcus glanced at the security cameras, the empty aisles. The store was dead quiet. "A woman called me here one night. She claimed she worked there. She said there were more kids, that the police only scratched the surface." Damian scratched his chin. "She might be our in. If we can locate her, or someone else on the inside, who's willing to talk. But these folks can be dangerous. If there's a bigger network involved, they won't hesitate to intimidate or threaten people who poke around." A chill seeped into Marcus's gut. "So what do we do?" Damian exhaled slowly, then produced a small notebook. "Let's start with what we can dig up legally. Public records, property records, licensing data from the state. Sometimes a paper trail leads to interesting connections, like repeated citations or a shell company that funds the place. If we can find those connections, we might blow this open. But I'll need your help. You're local, you're already somewhat involved. You might notice if something changes or if suspicious people come around." Marcus swallowed a lump of anxiety. He'd never pictured himself as any kind of investigator. Yet, he also couldn't stand by while kids might be suffering. "I'll do what I can," he finally said, voice shaky but resolute. They talked a little longer, discussing ways to exchange information securely. Damian insisted on caution. Email or phone might be monitored. He suggested using a burner phone or a private chat platform. Marcus, feeling out of his depth, just nodded, though the complexities of such cloak-and-dagger stuff made his head spin. Was he really about to get wrapped up in an investigation that might target a criminal network? The idea both terrified and galvanized him. Over the next week, while the rest of the town went about its usual routines, Marcus found himself living a double life of sorts. He'd work his shifts at the gas station, try to appear normal to coworkers and customers, but in the lulls, he'd be texting bits of info to Damian, license plate numbers of suspicious cars that idled behind the station, or anything new he heard on the scanner about the foster home. The monotony of scanning potato chips and fueling travelers felt surreal when contrasted with the swirling tension beneath the surface. Damian, meanwhile, started sending cryptic updates. The foster home's license was connected to a larger organization that specialized in special needs placements, but some of the addresses were P.O. boxes. He uncovered a labyrinth of paperwork that suggested certain children were being relocated to other states without the usual oversight. The journalist believed these relocations could be an illegal practice that turned foster care into a front for trafficking. It was horrifying to read. Each time Marcus received an update, he felt sick to his stomach, but also more determined. The local authorities, bound by regulations and procedure, might be moving too slowly. But the press could shine a spotlight that forced the truth into the open. That was the hope, anyway. All the while, Marcus couldn't forget the boy who'd started this all. He'd asked Ellis about his well-being, but the detective had few details. The child was staying in a safe environment with specialized counselors, apparently, but he was still too traumatized to offer a coherent statement about what exactly happened at that foster home. Then came a phone call from the detective that sent Marcus's stress soaring. Another child from that same house had gone missing, a young girl about 10 years old. She was last seen in the yard, but by the time police arrived, she was gone. The foster manager insisted the girl had run off, accusing the staff of incompetence. The tension escalated. Marcus felt that sense of dread intensify. Were they losing children to some hidden pipeline? True panic set in when, a few days later, the news reported the body of a young girl found by hikers in a ditch near another county. The authorities weren't yet releasing a name, pending identification and family notification. Marcus prayed it wasn't the same missing foster child, but he feared the worst. This horror was real, pressing in on him more each day. The quiet nights at the gas station turned from routine boredom to an anxious watchfulness. Every time a twig snapped outside, he jumped. One evening around 2:30 a.m., almost the same time he'd found the boy, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was that blocked number again. Heart hammering, he picked up. "Hello." The woman's whisper quivered with fear. "They're going to move some of the kids tomorrow. They've done it before. They threaten us, say if we talk, we'll lose our jobs, or worse. I can't stay silent anymore. Please, you have to help." Marcus's hand shook, but he did his best to remain calm. "Where are they moving them?" "The manager has a friend with a van. They do these night transfers to some place up north," she said, voice trembling. "I'm sorry, I don't have more. I need to hang up." And just like that, she was gone again. Marcus stood there, phone in hand, mind racing. He quickly texted Damien the gist of the call. Then he called Detective Ellis. It went to voicemail. Heart pounding, Marcus left a message. "Detective, I just got a tip that the foster home might be moving kids tomorrow. They do night transfers with a van. We have to do something." He expected the detective wouldn't check his phone until morning. But to his surprise, Ellis called back within minutes. "Marcus, it's nearly 3 in the morning. You're sure about this information?" "Yes," Marcus insisted. She sounded terrified. "She works there, I think. She said they move kids at night. If they do it before Child Protective Services can finalize any action, who knows what'll happen to them." Ellis exhaled audibly. "Alright, calm down. We've got a small detail keeping an eye on the place, but I'll coordinate with them. If they see any van heading out, we'll have a legal reason to stop them for questioning. In the meantime, you stay safe. If your source calls again, tell her to contact us directly." Marcus hung up, still feeling uneasy. He didn't know if the police would act fast enough. For the rest of his shift, he was a bundle of nerves, fiddling with receipts and triple-checking the store's doors. Images plagued him. A sinister van pulling away from that house in the dead of night, children huddled in the back, silent tears rolling down their faces. "They only keep the quiet ones," that boy had said. The memory slammed into Marcus's thoughts again and again. At daybreak, Marcus turned on the local news in the station's small office TV. No major developments. No stories about a raid or rescue. Just typical morning fluff. He trudged home when his replacement arrived, feeling the weight of hopelessness. Sleep was impossible. He paced his cramped apartment, phone clutched in hand. Finally, mid-afternoon, a text arrived from Damien. Police took action. They've picked up a suspicious van near the foster property. Hearing rumor children are safe. More soon. Relief crashed over Marcus like a wave. He didn't know the details, but at least it seemed they'd intervened in time. Shortly after that, Ellis called. "We intercepted a van, Mr. Turner. They were transporting 2 kids. The driver claims it was a routine relocation, but there were discrepancies in the paperwork. So we're holding him for further questioning. We also have a warrant to search the home more thoroughly." "That's great," Marcus said, breath unsteady. "So it's over?" Ellis's pause told Marcus the answer. "We'll see what turns up in the search. But these things can go deeper. We suspect there may be more people involved. For now, we're placing the children from that house into protective custody. CPS is stepping in, and a few new child victims have already hinted at abuse. This is far from over, but we've made progress." Marcus swallowed, tears of relief gathering in his eyes. He'd never thought he'd be at the center of something so big, so awful. A swirl of conflicting emotions, relief that children were being saved, fear that the worst was yet to be uncovered, and guilt that he might have done more sooner, threatened to overwhelm him. He thanked the detective and ended the call. Moments later, Damien texted again, asking Marcus to meet him at a local coffee shop in a couple hours. The journalist said he had big news to share. Despite his fatigue, Marcus went. The coffee shop was modest, the kind with second-hand couches and mismatched mugs. He found Damien huddled over a laptop, scanning something intently. "Over here," Damien beckoned. Marcus slid into the seat across from him. "You look like you haven't slept." "Neither have you," Damien said, eyes flicking up with a wry smile. "Listen, my sources say the state police and even the FBI are starting to take an interest. The foster home is just one piece in a bigger puzzle, a puzzle that might extend across state lines. There's talk of a larger trafficking operation, and this home could be a funnel for kids. So far, they're describing it as a well-concealed child trafficking network operating under the guise of foster rehoming. The authorities are pulling digital records, phone logs, bank statements. This might blow wide open soon." A chill crawled up Marcus's spine. "So it's bigger than just that manager?" Damien nodded gravely. "Yes. That manager's just a cog in a machine. I've discovered a few shady nonprofits funneling money to questionable institutions, presumably to pay for these private rehomings. The reason it's so well hidden is that it exploits the patchwork of foster care regulations across states." Marcus tried to wrap his head around the complexity. "Does that mean more children are in danger?" "Potentially." Damien nodded. "But on the flip side, if the FBI is involved, that means there's a chance these criminals will be shut down for good. I've been told not to publish any specifics just yet. There's concern it might tip them off. But soon, hopefully soon, the entire network will come crashing down." Marcus exhaled, feeling both dread and hope. "The boy I found, he and his sister, are they safe?" "Last I heard, yes. The sister was rescued too. They're receiving medical and psychological help." Damien closed his laptop with a tired sigh. "You did a good thing, Marcus. You might have saved a lot of kids. Once this is all done, I hope you realize the difference you made." Marcus felt a tangle of emotions, gratitude, relief, and guilt, all wrestling in his chest. "I just thought about my own daughter," he admitted, "about how helpless she'd be if she were in that kind of situation. I couldn't ignore him." Damien placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a brief moment of understanding. "You did the right thing." In the following days, the investigation ramped up. Multiple agencies descended on the foster home, combing every inch of the property. They found hidden rooms, piles of official documents that were either falsified or incomplete, and a computer containing encrypted files. Rumors surfaced that these files linked to interstate trafficking. The manager was arrested, along with a few others connected to the place. News spread fast, fueling public outrage. It was all over local TV, then regional news. Soon, national outlets began picking up the story. Horrific foster home raid exposes nationwide child trafficking ring. Marcus, exhausted and emotionally raw, watched the coverage from his living room, occasionally blinking away tears. He saw images of children, dozens of them, being led out of the building by social workers. Some wore blank expressions, others clutched teddy bears or worn blankets. He saw glimpses of officers taking away computers and boxes of files. The news anchors called the ongoing investigation a major break in a disturbing child trafficking ring. And he couldn't help thinking about that single moment at 2:43 a.m., how it all started with him hearing a sniffle and finding one terrified boy behind a freezer. A day later, the police asked him to come to a press conference. The idea was to recognize his actions, though Marcus felt uncomfortable with the spotlight. Still, the detective suggested it might encourage others to speak up if they see suspicious activity, reminding people that sometimes it's the ordinary person who makes the difference. Marcus showed up in his best shirt, standing awkwardly among uniformed officers and local officials. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed at him. He stammered through a brief statement about how he hoped every kid could find safety, about how he'd just done what anyone would do. Applause followed, but in his mind, the applause couldn't drown out the echo of those children's pain. In the flurry of media coverage, he was asked repeatedly for interviews. He gave a few, though he struggled to remain composed on camera. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper into the foster home's parent organization, discovering a chain of shady operators that stretched across multiple states. Politicians started calling for stricter regulations, new oversight committees, and reforms to ensure no child could ever fall through the cracks like that again. Yet, beneath all the righteous anger and public outcry, Marcus knew the investigation was still far from complete. Word on the street was that there were other foster homes in the network, other safe houses, other avenues through which children were bought and sold. The FBI had begun coordinating multi-state raids. Children were being rescued, but for every success story, there were horrifying tales of kids who vanished without a trace. Marcus couldn't help but remain anxious. He'd grown paranoid, seeing suspicious cars everywhere, wondering if some angry criminal might target him for interfering. But days turned into weeks, and there was no direct retaliation. Instead, there was a slow but growing sense of vindication as more arrests were made. The manager of the foster home, now behind bars, refused to cooperate, but digital evidence from his seized devices painted a damning portrait. It was enough to break open case after case. Amid the storm, Marcus found his own personal life in a strange place. He'd become something of a local hero. Neighbors nodded at him, grateful families sent thank-you cards to his apartment. He even got a small pay raise from the gas station manager, who was pleased by the positive attention. But that same station manager also warned Marcus not to let it go to his head, and not to do anything that might jeopardize store security. Life had a strange new normal. He was still scanning items, cleaning up coffee spills, listening to customers complain about gas prices, only now he was also fielding calls from reporters and occasionally testifying at preliminary hearings. One evening, about a month after it all began, Marcus got a phone call he'd been dreading, someone from the coroner's office. They'd identified the body of that girl found in the ditch. She was indeed the missing foster child. She'd suffered injuries that suggested severe abuse. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He sank onto his couch, tears rolling down his face. He had hoped, foolishly, that it wouldn't be her. That moment seared into his heart the magnitude of what was at stake. For all the kids they'd saved, one life slipped through the cracks. One precious life lost to cruelty. It crystallized his resolve. He would do everything in his power to see the ring fully dismantled, so no more innocent lives would be lost. The next day, Marcus asked Detective Ellis if he could sit in on one of the interviews with the rescued children. Maybe speak to the boy he'd helped, if it could help with trust. Ellis hesitated, but eventually allowed Marcus a supervised visit with the boy, who was in the care of a specialized child trauma center. The facility was a calm, quiet place with soft colors on the walls, cheerful murals, and stuffed animals piled in corners. Marcus was led to a small visitation room with child-sized furniture. He felt out of place, unsure if the boy would even remember him. But then the door opened and the boy stepped in, wearing fresh clothes and looking much cleaner, though still haunted. The moment he saw Marcus, his eyes lit with recognition. He didn't run for a hug or anything, but he smiled softly, the first real smile Marcus had ever seen on his face. The boy walked over and sat down at a small table, arms folded in front of him, glancing at Marcus with shy gratitude. Marcus's throat closed up. He wished he knew the right words to say. "Hey," Marcus managed after a moment. How are you doing?" The boy shrugged. His voice was still a bit muted, but no longer the terrified whisper from that night. "Better," he said. His eyes flicked to the door, as if still expecting to be dragged away at any moment. He fiddled with a small plush toy the staff had given him, pulling on its ears. Marcus cleared his throat. I'm glad you're in a safe place now. I was really worried about you." The boy nodded, eyes dropping to his lap. "They said my sister's here too," he whispered, tension flooding his small shoulders. "She's scared. We used to hide from him. From that man." The boy trailed off and tears welled up in his eyes. Marcus's own eyes stung in sympathy. He reached across the table, careful not to startle the child, and placed a hand gently over the boy's. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have helped sooner. At that, the boy let out a shaky breath. I was so hungry that night, he admitted, voice trembling. I thought I was going to die out there in the woods. Then I saw the lights from your station. It was the only thing. But I was so scared to ask for help. Marcus's heart twisted painfully. He squeezed the boy's hand. You were really brave to keep going. He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. Just know that people are fighting for you now. Good people who won't let this happen again. The boy nodded, brushing away tears. Thank you. A staff counselor soon came in, gently signaling that the session needed to end. Marcus stood, giving the boy a small pat on the shoulder. If you need anything, I'm around, Marcus said softly, though he wasn't sure how he could be involved beyond moral support. The boy gave a tiny nod, then left with the counselor. Marcus left the center, tears still fresh on his face, but with a renewed sense of determination. No matter how long this fight took, he had to see it through. He had a stake in this now, not just because he found the boy, but because he believed no child should ever have to live in terror. The months that followed were a roller coaster of investigations, hearings, and revelations. More arrests were made. Public outrage grew as the media uncovered how neglected and abused children could vanish so easily in a system riddled with loopholes. Politicians scrambled to propose reforms. Grassroots organizations sprang up, protesting, demanding accountability from state agencies. Marcus was invited to speak at a local rally about child welfare, but he declined, overwhelmed by the attention. Instead, he sent a letter that was read to the crowd, urging the community not to turn a blind eye when something seemed amiss. Damien published a series of exposés, each more shocking than the last, detailing how unscrupulous foster operators would pocket government checks, sometimes rehoming children for profit, and forging documents to mask the transfers. The stories included testimony from survivors, children who managed to escape or who were rescued. Some told horrifying tales of being locked in rooms, barely fed, beaten for disobedience. A few were forcibly sent to other states under the pretense of new foster placements, only to be abused or trafficked. The scale was staggering. Meanwhile, the FBI and local law enforcement, buoyed by mounting public pressure, charged full speed ahead, raiding suspected safe houses, confiscating computers, and closing in on the ringleaders. Each new bit of evidence seemed to confirm that the foster home behind the gas station was indeed part of a larger, meticulously concealed network. One day, Detective Ellis called Marcus to provide a critical update. We've managed to decrypt some of the files seized from the foster manager's computer. It's a ledger, basically. Names, ages, transaction amounts, dates. We're talking hundreds of children over a span of years, maybe more. And if we follow the money, it leads to a group that has connections in several states. Marcus felt physically ill. Hundreds, he repeated, almost too stunned to comprehend. He remembered that harrowing call the boy made for help that night, the frightened sister, the children he saw on the news being led out of that place. He couldn't imagine the scale of abuse for hundreds. Please tell me they'll go away for life. Ellis's voice was grim but resolute. They're being charged under federal statutes. Even now, there are multiple arrest warrants out. We're expecting a major sting operation. With the evidence we have, convictions are very likely. You've done a good thing, Marcus. That refrain, "You've done a good thing," had been repeated many times over the past months, but Marcus still felt that pang of grief for the children who weren't found in time. At least now, though, it felt like momentum was on the side of justice. Finally, after months of preparation, the FBI launched simultaneous raids in 3 different states, scooping up members of the trafficking network. Media outlets broadcast live coverage. Indictments were announced. Photos of suspects lined news segments, each face representing a piece of the monstrous puzzle. One by one they were caught. High-profile arrests followed. Some of the perpetrators were well-known community figures, fueling public outrage and betrayal. The ring was bigger than anyone could have guessed. Then, one crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after that fateful night, Marcus got a phone call from an unknown number. This time, the voice was steady and calm, the same woman who had called in a terrified whisper. She introduced herself as Heather, an employee at the foster home, the one who'd given him crucial tips. "I'm safe now," Heather said, emotion cracking through her composure. "I resigned from that awful place just before the raids. The FBI interviewed me, and I told them everything I knew. I just wanted to thank you for believing me, for not hanging up. Without you, I don't know if those kids would have been saved." Marcus's throat tightened. "I'm just glad you're safe," he managed. He paused, remembering her fear. "How did you end up working there if it was so terrible?" Heather sighed heavily. "I was young, idealistic. I wanted to help kids in need. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped, threatened by the manager. He told us if we talked, he'd say we were complicit. I was terrified. But after seeing the state of those kids, I couldn't keep silent anymore. The night I called you, I was desperate." A wave of gratitude and relief washed over Marcus, along with sadness for how many had suffered. "I'm glad you reached out. I'm sorry about everything you went through." They spoke a bit longer, Heather revealing how twisted and manipulative the manager was. She'd witnessed punishments doled out for kids who tried to speak out or run away. It was worse than Marcus had imagined, and he'd already imagined plenty of horror. After the call ended, he sat quietly, letting the magnitude of it all sink in. Finally, the day of the big hearing arrived, the day many had awaited. A federal prosecutor laid out the case against the ringleaders in a packed courtroom. Marcus, though not directly testifying that day, attended as a public observer. The atmosphere crackled with tension. One by one, the prosecutors presented evidence, photos, ledgers, statements from children. The defendant's lawyers tried to argue it was all a misunderstanding, that the Fosters had mental health cases that were complicated, that the rehomings were legitimate. But the sheer weight of the evidence, especially the digital trail, was overwhelming. The highlight came when one of the rescued children, now a teenager who had spent years under the network's control, bravely testified about the abuse, the threats, the constant terror. Her trembling voice carried across the silent courtroom, leaving no room for doubt about the cruelty inflicted. By the end of that day, no one in the audience could look at the defendants without disgust. Eventually, convictions rolled in. The manager of the foster home was found guilty of multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit trafficking, child endangerment, and falsification of documents. He faced a lengthy prison sentence. Other higher-ups also faced serious time. Some parties pleaded guilty for reduced sentences, but even then, they were going to prison for decades. The media hailed it as one of the largest busts of its kind in the region, shining a harsh light on the ugly underbelly of foster system corruption. Reforms were introduced, budgets reallocated for thorough background checks, and specialized task forces were formed. It felt like a turning point, at least in this corner of the country. Marcus watched the coverage from his living room, tears of relief streaming down his cheeks. It was finally happening, accountability. He thought back on that haunted boy in the gas station, how easily he might have brushed him off, told him to leave, or assumed he was just a runaway who would be better handled by someone else. That single choice, to help him, had been a domino that toppled a monstrous operation. In the weeks that followed the convictions, the dust began to settle. Life tried to inch back to normal for Marcus, though normal now had a different flavor. He still worked his shifts. The gas station had replaced a couple of faulty lights, giving the store a slightly less eerie ambience at night. People recognized him more often, offering kind words or quiet nods of respect. He tried to handle it humbly, never quite comfortable with praise. Then, a local children's advocacy group organized a community event to celebrate the rescued kids' progress. It was a modest affair, held in a park near a lake, with a few carnival rides, face painting, and a barbecue. The weather was bright and warm, a gentle breeze stirring the scent of grilled food through the air. Marcus went, drawn by curiosity and a yearning to see how the kids were faring. Near a group of picnic tables, he spotted the boy and his sister. They looked healthier, wearing clean clothes, their faces no longer drawn with fear. He hesitated, unsure if they would remember him, or if they'd want him to approach. But as he lingered, the boy caught sight of him, and a broad smile lit up his face. He nudged his sister, pointing. She looked over, eyes brightening. They both walked toward Marcus. "Hi," the boy said, voice louder and steadier than Marcus had ever heard it. He clutched his sister's hand, and she gave Marcus a shy wave. Marcus knelt slightly. "Hey, buddy. Good to see you." He looked at the sister. "And good to see you too. How are you both doing?" She spoke softly but clearly. "We're okay now. We have a new place, and our foster parents are really nice." Her voice wobbled a bit. "They don't yell at us." Marcus nodded, choking back emotion. That's great. You both deserve so much happiness." The boy took a step closer, gazing up at Marcus with a solemn expression. "Thank you for finding me that night." Marcus swallowed hard, his vision blurring with tears. "Thank you for being brave," he managed. "You saved a lot of other kids by what you did." The boy nodded, glancing around at the other children running and laughing in the park. "I'm glad they're not there anymore. I still have nightmares sometimes, but my counselor says it'll get better." Marcus placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Will, you've got so many people in your corner now." They parted ways after a few minutes, the siblings joining their new foster parents at a nearby table. Marcus stood watching them for a while, an ache in his heart, equal parts sorrow for what they'd endured and hope for the future they might now have. For once, he felt that maybe, despite all his own regrets and failures, he'd done something truly worthwhile. As the sun sank lower and the carnival games wound down, Marcus joined some local families around a small bonfire near the lake's edge. The kids roasted marshmallows, while adults chatted quietly about the next steps for the community. There was talk of establishing a permanent children's shelter, of setting up mentorship programs. The ring's discovery had ignited a wave of empathy and resolve, galvanizing people to do better. Marcus listened, occasionally chiming in, touched by how adversity had spurred a newfound unity. Eventually, the event ended. Marcus headed to his car, his footsteps light, a sense of closure warming his chest. The ring was broken, many children rescued, the main criminals behind bars. He felt a pang of sadness for those who hadn't been saved soon enough, like that lost girl in the ditch, but also recognized that tragedies can motivate lasting change. People were paying attention now. In the following weeks, Marcus found an unexpected sense of purpose. He reached out to a volunteer program for at-risk youth, offering to mentor a teenager who'd been in and out of foster care. It was a small commitment, just a couple hours a week, but it gave him a direction. He also took steps to reconnect with his own daughter. The guilt of his past still weighed on him, but he no longer felt paralyzed by it. If this experience had taught him anything, it was that second chances weren't just possible, they were essential. Through tentative phone calls and awkward text messages, he began rebuilding a bridge with the child he'd lost in his divorce. She was hesitant, but not closed off. When Marcus confessed to some of his regrets, she admitted she'd just missed him and wanted him in her life. One evening, he mustered the courage to drive to the city where she lived. They met in a coffee shop, and after a series of cautious, half-smiling exchanges, they hugged, tentative, then tight. He realized he might not reclaim those lost years, but they had a future to build, and that was enough. Time rolled on. The media spotlight eventually moved to other stories, but the reforms sparked by the scandal continued. New legislation was passed, bolstering oversight of foster care agencies, closing loopholes that allowed unscrupulous operators to hide. Nonprofits sprang up to support children who'd been victims of trafficking, helping them integrate into safer environments. And whenever someone asked how it all began, locals would recount the story of a gas station clerk who listened, who acted when others might have walked away. One crisp morning, about a year and a half after the initial discovery, Marcus found himself standing outside that same gas station, leaning against the pump as the sun rose. The air smelled of dew and diesel fumes. He sipped a lukewarm coffee, letting a sense of calm wash over him. He had the day off, no pressing obligations for once. The store manager grumbled that he couldn't let go of the star employee, but Marcus insisted that he needed a break. Today, he just wanted to stand here, soak in the dawn, and remember how, not so long ago, a single quiet sniffle had pierced the silence, altering countless lives forever. He breathed in the cold air, eyes drifting toward the edge of the woods behind the station. The same dense trees that had once hidden a terrified child. Now, they stood as silent witnesses to the chain of events, the place where footprints had led the police to unimaginable horrors. Marcus found himself reflecting on the surreal journey, how darkness had given way to light, how fear had been replaced by a measure of hope. None of it erased the sorrow, but it made life's fragile beauty stand out more. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Hey Dad, can we get dinner tonight?" A small, ordinary question that felt monumental. He smiled, typing back a quick yes, and realized that for the first time in a long while, he was genuinely looking forward to the future. To the outside observer, Marcus was just a middle-aged man in a gas station parking lot, sipping coffee. But inside, he felt changed, less haunted, more determined to keep seeing the good in people, to keep stepping up when help was needed. It was the least he could do to honor those children's lives, the ones saved and the ones tragically lost. He hopped in his car, deciding to pay a quick visit to that park where the kids' event had been held. He didn't have a reason, maybe just to remind himself that there was light in the world. He pulled onto the highway, the early sun bright in the sky, and pressed the gas. The local radio droned on about upcoming weather, barely a blip of real news, which was fine by him. Quietly, he reflected, if not for that moment, if not for that phone call, how many more children would have vanished? A few minutes later, he arrived at the park. It was mostly empty this early, just a mother pushing a stroller along the walkway. Marcus parked and walked toward the lake, the surface like glass. He stood there thinking about the boy's words, "They only keep the quiet ones," that might have once referred to forced silence. But now, he preferred to interpret it differently, that there was a silent resilience in these kids, a quiet strength that refused to be broken. And with enough help, that silence could turn into a roar for justice. He sat on a bench, letting the day unfold around him. He caught the faint sound of birds calling. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself breathe. The ring was dismantled. The foster home was shut down. Children were recovering, receiving love and care. More parents were stepping forward to demand improvements in the system. A wave of relief washed through him. He might never fully shake the sadness for what those kids endured, but at least some measure of healing was possible. Later that evening, after his dinner with his daughter, where they laughed awkwardly at first, then genuinely as the night went on, Marcus checked the local paper online. Headlines spoke of ongoing prosecutions, successful adoptions, a state commission investigating all foster homes in the region. He thought of the siblings, safe now, forging a new path. He thought of Heather, freed from a job that chained her to guilt. He thought of the families who still searched for missing children, their heartbreak fueling the push for answers. And he realized how one single act of compassion at 2:43 a.m. had spiraled into something greater than himself. As he got ready for bed, he glanced at his phone and noticed the camera icon. He had a short clip from that community event, just a snippet of kids running around, squealing with joy, the boy and his sister among them, grinning ear to ear. Marcus played it back once, smiling softly at the image. He closed his eyes, letting hope settle into his heart. There would still be challenges, still be darkness in the world. But sometimes all it took was one person to hear a cry in the night and act. So, if you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you. Always remember, if you see something off, if you hear that quiet cry for help, don't ignore it. Your choice to get involved could save lives. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the hidden corners of our world. And thanks for watching.